When Eastern swords influence Western swords. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and Easton Antique Arms. Now, potentially this would be a huge topic worthy of several volumes of books, and I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to show one specific aspect of sword design which carried over from, let's say, the East, in some cases the South, to the West. And when we say the West, we're really talking in this case about Europe and potentially America as well. So what I'm holding in my hands here is a pala or kilich. It is an Ottoman sword, and you will notice it has certain features which are particular to these. Some of those features are also similar to the shamshir. The shamshir has a different form of blade. We're not going to be talking about shamshir here, other than to say that indeed forms of kilich and shamshir, of course, as we've spoken about in the past, influenced general swords, particularly in the Napoleonic period and thereafter, and it became very characteristic for generals in Western European and indeed Eastern European militaries to carry what came to be known as Mamluk hilted swords. And the reason they're called Mamluk hilted swords is because this really stems from the conflict in Egypt, primarily between France and Britain in the Napoleonic Wars, where a lot of the top staff and generals took to wearing local Egyptian, then Ottoman and Mamluk style shamshirs and kiliches as their dress swords essentially, and this became hugely influential. So today's video is sponsored by Movaglobes, link below, and there's a special offer just for viewers of this channel. I've now got several Movaglobes. I've had them for a few months, and I even gave one as a Christmas present. They're fantastic gifts. They are the globes, they're educational, they look cool, and they rotate from the power of the sun alone. So long as they have access to UV light, they just sit there rotating forever. I absolutely love the way they float around inside the ball like this. Now, Movaglobes come in a variety of designs. You've got a whole bunch to choose from there on the website. This is actually Lucy's, and this one is mine. And they come with a variety of different stands. This is the pretty much standard Perspex stands that come with them, but you can choose wooden stands and various different types of designs there on the website. And also, they've got great educational value to them as well. And these are also a great talking point when we have guests over. They pretty much always want to come over. They go, wow, what's that? And they want to pick it up and handle it. So my special offer for you here today, just for viewers of this channel, I've got a special URL down below, down in the description there. If you click on that and you use the discount code SCHOLAR, you can get 10% off the 6 or 8 inch globes. And thanks again to Movaglobes for sponsoring this video. The use of this style of hilt actually goes all the way back much earlier, and the earliest days of Ottoman influence in Europe. So essentially the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, and we get these type of hilts being adopted in places like Poland and Hungary and lots of areas, even in Austria, parts of Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And so this type of sword, via not just Ottoman influence, but also to some degree Persian and earlier on Mamluk influence, certainly has an influence on swords. Now, before I get into the particular feature that I want to talk about here, which is the flared false edge here, or yeoman, I just briefly want to talk about the fact, and this is something which needs a lot more research, and it's a more difficult period to research, and that is the medieval period, particularly the 15th and into the early Renaissance, into the 16th centuries. Now, it's fairly well evidenced now, I think, although there needs to be a lot more research done on it, that the Ottoman expansion did influence certain features, not the total design of the sword, but that's even true of the Napoleonic era, as we're going to see in a minute. But they did influence probably certain features of weapons being used in Europe, and also clothing. We're pretty sure that certain styles of hat and other clothing was influenced by the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. But indeed, if we look at certain hilt constructions and hilt forms, particularly pommel shapes as well, and indeed blade forms as well, and I'm not saying specifically this Wakefield type hanger based on the one in the Royal Armoury is necessarily an example, but we do see the rise of certain types of mesa and falchion in the 15th and through to the 16th centuries, and some of those, if not all, some of those seem to exhibit features which take influence from North Africa and what we now call Turkey and places like Syria and Persia. Right, so setting that aside, so coming back to this particular feature, so Shamshir don't have this. Shamshir have a solid back all the way up here, and they don't have this section that we call a yelman, or is called a yelman, on a Turkish sword, which we can call a kilic or a pala. Just to briefly mention that, you'll notice I switch names with these quite a lot. Quite simply, kilic just means sword in Turkish, so it's a bit like talwar in Indian. In English language, we refer to talwar to refer to the typical Indian curved sword, and we refer to either a Mamluk hilted sabre, or Mamluk Shamshir, or Mamluk kilic, Mamluk hilted kilic in English language, but this isn't really historically very accurate. Anyway, so this is a kilic or pala, but it's a Turkish sword, Ottoman sword, and this is a 19th century example, but you'll notice it has this characteristic shape up here, which is very different to the blade down here. So one of the characteristic features of these is they have a kink in the middle of the blade, so they're almost straight for the first half and then almost straight for the second half, but they have a bend in the middle. So they're literally, in European sources, they're sometimes referred to as bent swords, because they do look a bit like that. But they have this raised section at the back. Now, this raised section actually can be found going all the way back before 1000 AD, so we can find it in, shall we call them Turkic, Mongol Turkic sabres from really quite early on, and it is a feature that's actually been around for hundreds of years. It wasn't a new thing, and it wasn't even a new thing in Europe, because if we look on the edges of Charlemagne's empire, we find people using these type of Turco-Mongol and indeed sort of people like the Avars and people like that using these types of sabres that sometimes do have a yelman or flared back edge. However, that doesn't seem to have influenced Western or Western European swords for really quite a long time. We do, however, start to see this feature come into Western European swords from about the 15th century, about the time that the Ottoman Turkish Empire is starting to impinge on and conquer the edges of what we commonly call Europe, so areas of the Balkans and obviously the Byzantine Empire and so on and so forth, and influencing swords in places like Poland and Lithuania and Hungary as well. So, and you've got the Huns in there as well, the Hunnic kind of influence. So fundamentally, we start to see this influence, particularly Turkish influence, Ottoman influence, in the 15th century and really strongly in the 16th century. And once we get into the 16th century, we literally see Western European swords being made almost in the Ottoman style, or very heavily influenced by the Ottoman style. Now, funnily enough, this is actually, history repeats itself. We actually see this later on in India with the British Empire, where we actually see forms of European, essentially, as we call them now, Mamluk hilted sabres, influenced by the swords in India, which themselves were influenced by Persian and Ottoman swords. So it's a very, very complex relationship. And so these types of swords, obviously we've talked about the hilt type, which is actually quite universal across a lot of the Islamic world. But even the blades, now this only has the very slightest hint of a yelman, but it is there. This isn't a Shamshir blade. This is a blade with a T-section to it. This is Indian, incidentally, with a T-section to it, influenced by the Ottoman pala, which famously has a T-section blade instead of the wedge section blade that Shamshir tends to have. So it's got a T-section blade and then the hint of a false yelman. And this was almost certainly made for a British officer, or perhaps a high-ranking Indian officer serving in the British Army or the East India Company in India in the 19th century. But what I'm now going to show you is a great example that's recently come into my hands of a Napoleonic British officer's sabre that clearly shows this Turkish influence, this Ottoman influence, but also shows some absolutely European features, and in one case even a specifically English feature. Right, so here is the sword. I will dispense with the scabbard straight away because that's not of interest to us for this particular video. But here is the sword. Now, some people out there would refer to this as a flank officer's sabre, and indeed, There are lots of other sabres which were made for officers of, sometimes they're referred to as frock sabres, so sometimes there's an implication that they were worn with dress wear. I actually don't hold with that because they tend to be completely not ornate and have steel hilts. I think they were non-regulation infantry officers' sabres for the most part. They're almost always too short to be cavalry sabres. They are for people on foot. They usually have 31-inch blades or shorter, so anything between about 27 and 31-inch blades. So they're really too short for a cavalry officer. They are clearly officers' private purchase swords, and their proportions and their shape and their form suggest to me used by infantry officers, and because they don't have the 1803 pattern hilt, it suggests they probably for the most part date to before 1803 or maybe about 1805, by which time the 1803 pattern would have been more common, more prevalent and more expected in regiments. So I think most of these date to about 1800 and are for British or people allied to the British, sometimes, you know, Dutch or whoever, infantry officers. Now this specific one actually has the hints of the remains, you won't be able to see it on camera, of the strung bugle of rifles or potentially of a light infantry regiment. So this is specifically a sword for a light infantry or rifles officer. Now, let's examine its features. It has a raised yeoman. There we go. So this is the bit that really made me make this video. That is 100% inspired by Turkish swords of the time, because this sword, for all I know, these could be about the same date actually. Although it's a much less severe curve and it's a more even curve and it's not a sudden kink in the blade, that slightly raised yeoman is very much emulating Turkish swords. And also look at the shape of the point. They're extremely similar. So this is a British made sword for a British officer, this is a Turkish made sword for a Turkish officer, but this is clearly inspired by. And that's again largely because of the Egypt campaign and just generally speaking, not just through one route, so not just being influenced directly by the Ottoman Turks, but also particularly British and you could say French to some degree as well, swords of this period, the Napoleonic Wars, were being influenced by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and people like the Polish as well. Remember, the Polish lancers were very prominent in Napoleon's army. And what are hussars? Hussars, which were a form of light cavalry that were becoming prevalent in Europe at the time, were modelled on East European and Central European light cavalry. The Hussars themselves are an Eastern European institution and they were being copied in countries like Britain, France, Spain and so on. And indeed fashion was as well, so the style of pelisses, the kind of Austrian knotwork that we see on jackets and customs, a huge amount of influence coming from Austro-Hungary. Moreover, even John Gaspard Le Marchant, who designed the 1796 pattern light cavalry sabre and chose the 1796 pattern palash for the heavy cavalry, had worked with the Austro-Hungarian or the Austrian cavalry and military and was highly influenced by them. So there was a huge amount of influence, not just directly from the Ottomans at this time, but and the Mamluks as well, but indirectly through Eastern Europe, and they themselves got some of these fashions and styles and inclinations from contact with the Ottoman Turks. Now, I mentioned this also has very British features. Well, quite clearly, the outline of this is modelled on the 1796 pattern light cavalry sabre. So this is directly inspired by John Gaspard Le Marchant's designs of 1796. Ergo, we know the sword dates to after 1796 and probably before 1805. But there's another feature here, and that is a feature which largely is taken from spadroons of the 18th century. So we find that from the let's say about 1760 onwards, a lot of spadroons have this sidebar, and this fulfills a very similar function to a side ring that we find on earlier late medieval and Renaissance swords. It protects the back of the hand for a right-handed person. Obviously, if you're left-handed, it'll have to be on the other side. So here we've got a combination of features. We've got a Turkish inspired or maybe Mamluk Ottoman or maybe Eastern European inspired blade married to a completely British, although you could say that the prototype of this style of hilt does actually come from Austro-Hungary again, but 1796 pattern hilt with this rather English feature, British but more particularly English feature of this sidebar on the side of the hilt there. So there we go, really a marriage of cultures and history and migration and interaction between different martial cultures and different people that came together around the year 1800 to create this rather attractive looking sabre, and I have to say a very nice thing it is too. So I hope that's been somewhat interesting. Obviously this is a huge topic. We could talk a lot more about the hilt features of Mamluk style hilts and things like that maybe in a future video. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope I'll see you next time. Cheers folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.